All right, well, let's get going. I'll get you all to introduce yourselves. My name is Barbara Ryan and I am the chair of EMPA. And Disaster Diaries is roughly 2 sessions every 3 months. We alternate between an academic research article and a book. So far, we've looked at Currowan, the bushfires, written by a survivor from southern New South Wales, and that was really interesting. Then we did an article on false information, and now we are looking at Paradise Built in Hell. So hopefully you've all managed to read at least some of the book, and Drew's going to be here vicariously listening to what we say. So I'll get you all to go around the room and just introduce yourselves. I'll start with who I can see next on my screen, who is Monica. So if you can tell us where you're from, what your current role is, and a little bit about your job.
Hello. So I'm Monica. I'm from Macedon Ranges Shire Council, and I'm part of the storm recovery team here after those big storms that happened in June of 2021. We had a little 4-man recovery team stood up, and we recently had our contract extended for another 12 months, so really settling into things. Before this role, I was at the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Victoria, which I do see a lot of similarities about, isolated communities and that sort of thing, and always had an interest in crisis and risk. My background's just general communications, but this has been a really interesting opportunity to learn more about what's happening. So this is my first EMPA thing that I am attending. So Susan, thank you. My manager recommended and said it was really fascinating and really exciting. So thanks for having me along.
Thanks, Monica. Drew.
All right. As for EMPA New Zealand, the conferences, I've been to all but one. Still going again next month. I've been a PIM. I was a PIM. I'm now doing Intel. But as a communicator, still remain that way because my focus has now moved from response PIM into readiness and recovery. I'll say I've been a PIM since 2009, and I went to Intel last year.
And can you just explain, Drew, what PIM stands for?
It's Public Information Manager in responses. So we have the SIMS structure, not the AIMS one. And those sub-functions, one of them is public information management. And I guess for me, it's been a public information manager or manager of the team function in about 35 or more responses. I'm passionate about communication and people. And as for my reading ability, it's been a bit soaked up because on the side, I'm also a voice actor. So I've been narrating and acting in other people's novels. My head's been in that space more, but I've popped back from a whole lot of catch up on a whole lot of things. And this is my first day pretty much back going, all right, let's carry on for a while. Not like years, it's just been swamped in other projects. So for EMPA, I haven't had a chance to focus on this for a few months. So hi guys, nice to be part of the first book review that I've ever been in.
Thanks, Drew.
Thought I'd be able to watch from the sidelines, but Bob doesn't make that possible.
Peter, where are you from?
I'm from the Victorian Department of Health. It's going to be a challenging one for you, Barb. I'm also new to this group. I saw the EMPA stuff come up, and I thought I was keen to find out a bit more about what you did, and certainly saw the book too, which I thought was a very interesting base. I manage emergency management for the North Division of Victoria, so I'm not in public information directly. And I was hoping like Drew to be sitting somewhere in the background while this went on.
Yeah, we're usually quite a small group.
So I haven't read the book. I've listened to the book. I do a lot of driving, covering most of the north of Victoria. So talking books are my way of catching up on my reading. So it was an interesting book read. So yeah.
Okay, well, seeing there's a couple of you who are new to EMPA, EMPA is an organisation that it's moved sort of from a really informal membership model to a community of practice model for people who are in communication and community engagement in all phases of emergency and disaster. And so the people who are involved with EMPA are usually emergency management agencies, but also councils, people who are, have representatives on local level district disaster committees, district level, and also state level, and could be government organisations, consultancies, private organisations, not-for-profits, that type of thing. And we hold 2 conferences each year, one in Australia and one in New Zealand. New Zealand is coming up 17th to the 19th of October this year in Wellington. And Australia will be in Brisbane next year, 7th to the 9th of June. And usually it's a half-day workshop and 2 days of speakers, and quite a good focus on the community too. So we're trying to reach the community in everything we do. So we try and get community in to talk to us about how well that worked or how well it didn't work. And we're also trying to build communities of practice in other areas. And the Disaster Diaries is the first of these, our small step into the community of practice space. We're hoping to get a little bit more formal down the track and probably cater for different levels of experience too. So we have quite a few entry level emergency communicators and community engagement people, right up to people who've been in the industry virtually since they left university or school and are very experienced. We have a webinar every month, and that's free. Next month it will focus on number 4 of our principles of excellence in communication, and that is about connecting communities. Really good webinars. We usually get 100 people or so to those, so really popular. Okay, so let's get going on the book. So Paradise in Hell, which sounds appalling, but turned out to be quite uplifting. I'm wondering what the key insight was that you took away from the book. So Monica, we'll start with you, as you and I have read the whole thing. Monica, we can't hear you. That's got you, I think. Maybe not. Oh, yeah. Yep, got it.
Is that better? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
look, I'm sorry. I've actually only read the excerpt as well.
Oh, okay.
So I intended to, and again, the audiobook is how I do a lot of my stuff. But I mean, I was really didn't know what to expect, and then, as you said, thought that this was going to be a bit depressing. But I really enjoyed just even from the excerpt that how they really trace back that historical, and it wasn't just about modern disaster and emergency, that consistency about what people have done and said, and the different impressions that can lead down different negative or positive paths, I think.
Yeah. Peter, had you read anything off? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm halfway through the book.
Oh, you listened to it. Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
So I have listened halfway through the book. I've got to say that she's probably not going to be my most popular writer, but the concepts that she brings out, I think, are rather interesting. And I put that in the perspective. I've been involved in emergency response, I think, from probably 1983 fires, and there's 2 key themes that I pick out that I've really brought out. One is that, and it's set in the American context. I think the Americans respond to things slightly different to us anyway, but it's built in the context that if you take away the rule of law, the whole world's going to fall apart and everybody's going to be at each other's throat. And the basic concept is that doesn't happen. Communities actually bond together. And that's actually
what we often see. So that sort of supported what I have seen. And she does mention that, you know, the looting that does go on in some areas, but it's very minor compared to everything else that goes on. And I've certainly seen in emergencies, it does bring out some people's bad habits. And I can tell you a few stories about that myself. One of the, I was going to lead off to something. I started life. I'm a social worker by background, so I started life as a critical incident debriefer. And the person who used to do the training for Victorian critical incident debriefers used to highlight that communities do bond together, and they start debonding when they after the emergency, and they come to it. But the other thing that she highlights in the book, which I thought was very interesting, is where a lot of the control comes in, that fear of losing control is not actually in reality. It's more that with communities bonding together, the people in power lose their powerful positions. And therefore, and she taught, it is from American background, so there's a fear of authority and fear of the army and fear of people in power coming in. But she talks about how the people in power use the army and that fear that everybody's going to be at each other's throat to re-establish their power in the aftermath. That it doesn't really, and I'm halfway through, so I'm wondering what happens in the end. But what I'm saying is that often when that gets to that debonding of communities, it's often assisted by the fact that the people in power are recreating the structures that keep them in power.
Yeah, so she goes on to develop this concept of elite panic. So I think early in the book, she talked about, you know, the concept that the community is going to panic, or the impression that the community will panic. And that was one reason for never giving the community any information at all. And finding that that doesn't exist. But at the other end of the scale, there is this elite panic, which we've seen in the US a lot, you know, with people wandering around on their front lawn with guns to protect their house and that type of thing. And yeah, so she talks about that elite panic. And I've sort of been thinking about there's a real cultural divide between what she talks about in this book and, from my perception, and where we sit in whatever country we're in, New Zealand, Australia, UK, because we don't have that individual doomsday prepper attitude to getting ready for disaster. So we're not thinking that everyone's, you know, we don't need to stock up on firearms because everyone's going to be raiding our pantry because they haven't done any preparation themselves. And you can see that coming out in the book, I think. Yeah, it was a really interesting phrase, that elite panic and that transfer of power. And I wonder whether, you know, I sort of think, and I'm coming from a point of view of an academic who doesn't work in an agency, but I am a volunteer with one of the agencies. I think we don't have that quite so systematized as they do in America. So, you know, so the doctrine is to hand over empowerment to the community in recovery. May not quite get there because there are obstacles within agencies that may prevent that from happening. But I just sort of look at that and think, yeah, there's quite a cultural divide between, you know, the example she gave and what we experience here. How do you all feel about that?
Yeah, I think I was wondering also if the fact that in Australia, at least, how certain agencies become the control agency for certain events almost combats that in some ways, because yeah, it seems like the American experience is very armed forces and police heavy. And a few of the examples that she used was, you know, the police chief just running his mouth off, and then that led things down in a direction. And it also reminded me of, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was that panic about everyone getting high on bath salts and eating each other's faces, and like they were saying that.
Didn't hear about that one.
Oh yeah, okay. And so it was basically again, someone was high on like meth or something and was delusional, attacked someone and killed them and ate their face, and then the police chief didn't want to admit there was like a meth problem in their town, and so said, oh, he was on bath salts. And then like worldwide there was this panic about bath salts, people doing drugs, bath salts. And it, when she was using her examples about one person just sort of giving these off the cuff kind of remarks, it seemed like that was a bit of their culture, like, and maybe having that reliance on, you know, the police as being the be all and end all authority in some of those examples. Maybe, we don't have that quite so much because there are, you know, topic experts in some ways with our, you know, fire, CFA being control agency or SES being control agency.
Yeah. And control's really good when you're in response, but doesn't work in preparation or recovery, does it?
So much.
So Peter, going back to that idea of the perceived transfer of power, later on in the book, she focuses a lot on how the community response can be interrupted by the regaining of that power. So the agencies finally get their act together and come in and then sort of, you know, really disperse the community. And she gave a couple of examples of where a community has resisted those efforts, or the response was so bad that there were so many vacuums still left that they could still operate. Have you seen anything like that happen in your area?
We have, and I'll go back to the Black Saturday fires, 2009. I was high enough in the echelons to probably start seeing this. So there was two particular circumstances. So at the Whittlesea Relief Centre, a nurse, rather than turn up to work, decided to set up the first aid centre in the relief centre, and got all her supplies from the local pharmacy and from Ambulance Victoria, and they were very supportive of what she did. And it was fantastic. She was, because in fact she was the only medical support we had in the relief centre, and became an instrumental part. But when it came to, and our whole policy of it was, we had the relief centre during the response as a place for people to come, but we needed to close it down quickly so people started going back to a normality of where they went to services. So there was a lot of support and communication done with her to bring her into the tent to then talk about how her first aid post would be transitioned back to the GP around the corner and things like that in the pharmacy. So it was bringing into the tent, and I was thinking, in the book, she talks about two examples that come to mind. One is during the San Francisco earthquake, where there was soup kitchens set up overnight, and I think this is the example you went for, that the soup kitchens didn't want to close down. They created a community thing. And I've certainly seen that come up too, because it gives people often who don't have status to have a status. And I suspect also with the soup kitchens in San Francisco, those people had a status. And they become central to the whole community and what's going on. So if they go back to their own normal, boring lives, there's not much left in it. The other side of it was, and I didn't see it, but I heard about it, up in Flowerdale, which, if you remember, during the Black Saturday fires became completely separated, isolated. So they had to depend on their own resources because there was nobody else coming in. And when they did come in, they really didn't want us to accept support from everybody else, because they felt very much that they'd been left behind, that nobody really cared about them. So if they didn't care about them, who was? And if they let go and depended on people coming in, we wouldn't be there for them. And so that took a lot of, I guess, communication, negotiation. We didn't send in the army, I guess, is the pertinent point. To back it up, whether it's the numbers, we simply don't have the numbers America has. It was very frightening about what they did. And I spent a lot of the time wondering, why was it any different? You've talked about our structure, that we have control agencies for different things. But in the UK, my understanding, I don't know it firsthand, the police are the control agency for every event, but rely on other resources, obviously, to manage health issues and things like that, but they are the key one. I wonder if it's an overall psyche of the community, because we don't hear about the police going in with their guns blazing into anything in the UK
No.
either.
What about your area, Drew?
Well, how specific do you want me to get? Okay, so can I step back a bit and talk about some of the concepts in the book from my perspective?
Yeah.
So just in the areas of the panic, for example, panic coming as a comment, panic coming from elites. I do find that to be, I don't really come from a perspective of elites the way she does, but I do, and I'm not overly convinced about it so much of the power exchange part of it, but I do know that there's this is being recorded. Someone could be watching this on
Go,
YouTube
General.
right now. There was a comment in there about someone's observation that people that panic seem to be more those from a distance. That's the part that resonated with me about the panic.
Okay. Yep.
For example, from the public information perspective, a lot of the panic comes from people, families, and other people interested outside the area, trying to get information about it. The people inside the area are quickly becoming socially cohesive. Often, if they have social cohesion, if they have communities, they're doing quite well at the beginning. You know, they're looking after each other. They're more active than panicky. So yeah, I agree. In my own personal experience, over the last decade or so, a lot of the panic is outside. So in fact, in my own, I'll go back to when I was at a district council, leading the public information management in storms or things like that. I would often look at the weather coming through and see that it would hit usual hotspots at high tide, then it would go down after high tide. What time's the high tide? It's a rush hour traffic time or whatever, or rush minute, depending on how small the community is. But in that you would know, so I kind of used to classify in my own head things as real disaster problem or entertainment value. Entertainment value encompassed for me the concept of outside people panicking. So that part resonated. Some of the elements of people trying to control things too much is also a thing that we've seen. And so it will be in local areas, but it'll be people who have some sort of responsibility in those areas. The ones that tend to act out of authority rather than acting as part of a community tend to do more damage, in my own observation. So when I look at some of those things, so San Francisco fire, panics about looting, turns out, for example, San Francisco, the looting, I don't know whether she got to that in the book because I didn't see that part, didn't get to read everything. So, but just in terms of research from history, business owners were trying to retrieve goods rather than panics about looting. And then the response to that, ends up people doing things that cause fires, but not the people and not the need for the fire in the first place. So you've got people burning things, out of dumb responses. So, there's elements of, but I hadn't, so anyway, so those sort of things resonate. Those patterns are there. The thing that I keep coming back to inside my own self through this is, when you look at, can we be better humans? Do we really need to feel like we're important? Because that seems to be like a sure chance of bad things happening. You know,
Yeah,
we're-
that's right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when we come together,
She did talk about the there's an organization in there and I just can't remember the name of it now. A really loose volunteer organization based on a couple of church organizations and hippie type organizations, and how they were able to do much more than Red Cross, which had all this bureaucratic system stuff to go through and, you know, had to check boxes and that sort of thing. That was really interesting. Monica, what about your jurisdiction? It's much smaller than the rest of us. So have you seen that sort of power, elite panic sort of power structure coming into sort of override any community activity?
Not specifically, no. I think we've been very fortunate that we had quite a strong connection with some like established community organisations that it was sort of established community organisations that stepped in to fill certain roles in the disaster. I think maybe the only similarity I can see, and I'm not sure if this is maybe completely off the wall, but in a storm, having an emergency that was a storm was quite different for our area. And so, you know, we're quite fire prone. We're very used to thinking, preparing, emotionally dealing with the what ifs of a fire. And so a storm that caused this much damage, even though we were very fortunate in that no one was killed, and while houses were damaged, it was, you know, no one was inside. Well, no one was killed when that houses were damaged. I think that sort of definitely it was a shock for the community. And so now when we're in the recovery phase and also looking at preparation, people, I'm not sure how to say this right, but it's almost like everyone now has a new understanding of what could go wrong in a storm, but because that wasn't expected, they're not quite sure where, like, the sky's the limit of, we could do this, we should do this, what if we did this to be prepared for that? And so it's almost like this new situation, it's sort of not the elite panic, but everyone's sort of getting ready to step into that decision maker, provider role, but without quite knowing how or having the structure or the plan, or, sorry, I'm not articulating this very well. Yeah, there's a lot of ideas of we could, but getting that groundwork in to make sure that there's actionable items, funding and that these ideas are sort of stand up against what evidence we have. That's where I see some similarities.
So what you were just talking about there was we, and that seems to indicate to me that it proves Drew's point, and probably is the foundation for a really good research article, that the closest that the power elite are to the community, the less likely they will be distanced from them in terms of the action the community wants to take. Very interesting. That's probably the case for most local governments.
And I do live in the Shire as well, which is, you know, you do get that everyday reminder, even when you're not at work, you're sort of having chats with people about different things. So yeah, definitely do feel that closeness, but also sometimes the gaps are very obvious between people who don't work at council and who do.
Okay, so was there anything? Oh, sorry, go on, Peter.
Yeah, I was also listening to that and thinking, and I don't know enough about the American structure to be able to comment, but our emergency response services are actually volunteer. Our CFA, our SES, and the majority of our emergencies we have of that, the scale that she's talking about, tend to happen in the rural areas. That's what CFA and SES. So we haven't had an earthquake as good as Melbourne. We haven't had half of Melbourne bombed or anything like that. So our response service at SES and CFA, they leave their houses on a regular basis to respond to these things without a concern about the safety of their house at home. Well, apart from natural disasters, not thinking about people coming in and destroying their property or anything while they're away. And I wonder if that's also, we've already got the built-in psych that we respond as a community.
That's right.
Even for those who aren't members of CFA,
Yeah.
SES, they still know they're there. They're still, you know.
Yeah, and those volunteers are their community, whereas the American example doesn't have that connection, I think. It's interesting. So the big question then is, how do we tap into the foundational trait of cooperation for our own work? So that concept that Kropotkin came up with, where altruism becomes an urgent need. How do we take advantage of that?
Drew was going to say something.
It was more just coming back to the last comment before we move to this one. So shall I just shush and move to the next one?
No, go on.
Well, there's just
Sorry,
that
I
part.
jumped in too early.
I was just still reflecting because I was trying to put it into words before, but I'll just go back to that piece in the book where she talks about Schmidt and San Francisco fires. You know, it was his chance to prove his worth, and the little, again, we'll come back to the little element of some word about looting going on, but there was a lot of people who owned businesses trying to get their stuff out, especially as there were some fires and there's not a lot of water and stuff. So, you know, they're trying to get, but it just he took it as an opportunity to prove his worth. So now he, in all his great power, ordered everyone, the backup he had, anyone who's looting, kill them. You know, so a lot of the people that got killed were actually business owners taking their property safely. But it was a big ego trip for the guy, and he'd been implicated in some stuff, and now this was his chance to, you know, be the man. So that's the sort of thing I think is devastatingly negative, because it tends to, it doesn't happen for people who care greatly about the community. It happens with people who care greatly about their reputation. There's often such a divide between the, never mind, I won't go any further. So to come back in, to tap into the altruistic nature, one is the more people are connected with each other, the more they care about each other, whether it's you care about your family, your friends, or your community in whatever way. You're more likely, if you work for your community, not work for yourself as an important person, so to speak, and trying to prove your worth, but just pitching in with people, you're more likely to have the altruistic community. And we see that here in ways where people would typically look at a community as they drive by and see that maybe there's low socioeconomic housing or circumstances, and imagine that's a vulnerable community because they don't have lots of money. But let's say the person up on the hill, let's just take this angle differently, the person up on the hill, expensive house, but might live alone, and they're not vulnerable, because if you base it on money, you know, this is where we see the one person alone commit suicide and the people in the community work together, because connection, not connection. Someone's abandoned, they're isolated. So it comes that psychological component. Whereas when you work together, it's not just supplying food to each other. It's, you know, food. Let's just take food. I did a thing with some kids recently. It wasn't me doing it. I was filming our scientists working with kids, doing hazards and consequences. And they had them write down a little poster, and they would put, where would you put food on these, you know, wellness, physical, different aspects. And they put it in two places. One, because we have a physical need for food. The other place they put it down was it brings people together because they come, you know. So there are elements of even these kids looking, and they came from a very communal community, a community that is, it takes a village to bring up a child type community. They come from this culturally, and the way the community is set up in terms of family and schools and everything is that. The difference is your immediate reaction is, how do you look after other people? So how do we build that in? Maybe by building community more, focusing more on community than focusing on bunkers of extra resources in the cupboards, you know, because you'll probably try to protect your resources, where if you're focused on being part of community, you'll focus on looking after each other.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
I came, if I heard this right, we're all aware during COVID we had a toilet paper run, and I heard the other day that our media unit, the best effect they had was to pull on people's altruism, to say if there's enough toilet paper, if you let your neighbour get what they need, there's enough for you as well. So it was pulling on that altruism. So again, it's pulling on the community.
Mm. Yeah,
Barb.
so I wonder how much our messaging does tap into that altruism. I tend to think maybe not. In some places it does, some places it doesn't.
Well, maybe it's, so take the phrase, our messaging. If we come at it from the perspective of an agency trying to tell people to be altruistic, I don't know if that's ever gonna do well. I think people smell what they imagine to be propaganda from institutions now. And, you know, around the world, a lot of people have had that shock of, that's not me, right?
Sorry,
okay,
I've got
cool.
calls coming in.
Is that a Skype call?
Team call.
I haven't
Team
heard
call.
that. Oh, was it?
Yeah.
it,
I actually better go. It's my boss.
Okay. Oh,
see you,
all
Peter.
right. Thanks
Bye.
for coming, Peter. Bye.
I guess there's one of the things coming in the EMPA conference for New Zealand. There's some stuff on the second day in the program, and it deals with a lot of that whole, people have been shattered. You know, when I say shattered, their trust in institutions has been shattered. They used to put all the trust in some, you know, the government will tell me what to do, or church will tell me what to do, or somebody, and then their trust has been shattered over time for various reasons, and now they can't see how to tell the difference between when it's trustworthy and when it's messed up. So I think there's an element of having to rebuild trust first before that becomes a platform for encouraging things. It's going to be a long, hard run.
Actually, we're finding that at the moment. I'm working with a fairly big team on doing research into community experiences of the Eastern Australian floods this year, which by all accounts hasn't finished yet. And it's really interesting because New South Wales SES was smashed, whereas Queensland experience was totally different. The SES is structured differently. Much of the communication is decentralized, and, you know, based on the volunteer model. People have been encouraged to be more independent, so not to have such high expectations, whereas New South Wales SES had a really good reputation. Then it restructured, centralized a lot of its operations, and left staff without support systems that they used to have. And just the scale of the disaster completely overwhelmed them. So those things all came together to really destroy SES's, not destroy it, but to really damage its reputation in New South Wales, whereas Queensland's a completely different experience. It's really interesting seeing the interviews. You know, we ask about expectations, and the interviews of the Queenslanders is completely different to the response the New South Wales people give us. It's really interesting.
Can I keep going with a thought on this?
Yeah.
Am
I interrupting again?
No,
Sorry.
no, you're not. I'm just passionate about it. But one of the things I think, it's a very soft thing, and it's a very hard thing to help people understand in a risk-averse environment. I mean, our whole purpose in a lot of these organizations is to mitigate risk, right? So it's a risky thing to have a conversational style compared to an authoritative, you know. So let's just take a careful step into this. A lot of our language, if we talk about communication, a lot of our language in organizations in response can easily become operational language. It can become scientific or academic or operational, and therefore it can become, I will tell you what to do. Here are facts, do something. And if you take it from a real conversational manner, it might be like, well, this is a thing, so looks like we're going to have to do this. It's just, sometimes it's the same message, but utterly conversational. But the more conversational you make it, the less it comes to seem like a telling you what to do organization, and more it seems like another human dealing with what you're dealing with.
Yeah, being connective. And if you don't make a connection, then they won't read or listen to the end of the message. So you've got to be speaking in the same language, don't you?
And the panic is sometimes the panic of operational people who are in charge of an operation. For them, for example, it becomes easy to take a meteorological statement and assume that the best thing you can do is reproduce it as is. You're not, ultimately you want to keep the facts as is, but it doesn't land well. Okay, so I have an experience. When I was early days of being a radio announcer, I had a really smart guy have a chat to me. He listened to my radio show and he said, "Why did you do the weather the way you did?" I was like, "Well, because that's how I was taught to do it, and that's how I was told to do it, and that's how we do it. The Met Service gave us this forecast, and you read it, and it sounds authoritative and it sounds official, therefore sounds professional, right?" And then in the end, he goes, "Well, if your mother asked you, can you put the washing out this afternoon? What's the weather going to be? Would you have said all that?" Like, no, I would have just said, like, it's a bit cloudy in the morning, but don't worry, the afternoon should be fine. Or it's a bit cloudy this morning, but it should rain this afternoon. So as long as you're home by lunchtime, you should be fine. Whatever. I said, "Why don't you say it like that?" And I never had to worry about it again because I learned to be conversational. But until you come back into these environments, and all of a sudden you have some fear that if you don't say it that way, you're not saying it right.
Yeah, you're forgetting though that you're the expert in the room. It's like, and I've worked with a lot of engineers who try and tell you to do your job, but when it comes to communication, you've been in it for a long time, you've studied it, you've experienced it, you know what works. You've just got to be, I am the expert in this field. This is how we're going to connect with them. If we don't capture them in the first 5 words, the old radio thing, if you don't capture them in the first 5 words, which goes in one ear and out the other, they're not going to listen to the rest of the message. So, and I tell my students that too. They sort of approach campaigns as an academic, justify every decision model. But if you've done the research and you've presented the results, then they need to rely on you to be able to make recommendations from those results without having to question your every motivation for doing that. It's just sort of, I think that's a function of, gaining respect within the agency that you're working in, and, just ensuring that the right way is the way that it's done. Yeah. And going back to that, Drew, too, like there are people within the agencies who are terrified of the community. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Have you come across that, Monica?
No, not really so far. I wouldn't say terrified. I do sometimes definitely say like a lack of perhaps trust that you are saying we should say it like this for a reason. That really struck a chord. And I think it also is sort of part of working in that risk in communications. You're always thinking, what if this person thinks of it like this? What if that person thinks about it like that? And reinterpreting your own message from so many different angles.
Yeah. And also understanding that we're talking to different groups of people too. You go, Drew.
On that one, so one of the things that, so yes, first of all, yes, when it comes to the science, so for example, tsunami science, we have all of the stuff that we need internally, all the gobbledygook that we actually need and we and we appreciate. But when it comes to the public thing, there's a much simplified layer. It's almost binary. Do you need to care, yes or no? If yes, then. If no, feel free to go back to sleep at 1 a.m. Don't worry about the tsunami, you're good. But in planning and readiness, you have that almost binary approach. So we have a very simple public layer, and it's taken a while, but I think those that we talk to a lot about it are coming to understand why we're doing that, to make differentiation between what we need in a system, emergency management system for our science, our proper decisions and why we're doing what we're doing, versus a greater simplicity for people in crisis. And when I say simplicity, I do not in any way mean writing for 9-year-olds, because very few of us can successfully write for 9-year-olds. Otherwise, we'd have written the Avengers movie and the Star Wars films. But people imagine writing for 9-year-olds to be dumbing things down. It's not. So, there's a simplicity of, do you need to care or not? There's a hierarchy of the way the brain as a human goes. I need to know this. Now that I care, now I'll need to know the next piece. If I need to know, if I don't need to care, I don't need to read the rest, and you work down. But so I guess one element to this that may help us, it's the same for those communicators within agencies as well as those in media. If we want to do a better job, we need to be better at storytelling, much, much better at reaching people's hearts and moving them and having those communication interactions that actually touch someone, that get through in those moments and not sounding utterly removed from human reality, or not relying on conflict to tell stories. There's a greater ability to do what we need to do to tell people what they need to tell without relying on super basic, low-level skill. The skill should go into how do you actually tell a story and what is that story. And no, a press release is not really a story. It's a story for people who just put PR out. Sure, but sure, you can tell it in a headline, tell it in a paragraph, tell it in a whatever, but that's not the kind of storytelling I'm talking about. It's the storytelling that works in entertainment for reaching minds and hearts and developing passionate fan bodies, right through to the kind of storytelling that
I think
we need to do better.
I think you might be grappling for a way to say that's put storytelling, successful storytelling is putting the person who's receiving the story into the story. So allowing them to make a connection between that story and their own life.
Yeah.
And then being able to recognize what they need to do.
And from an
sort of.
It is. And okay, so from an academic perspective, maybe for example, I can say people live maybe with an imperfect thesis in their life, and it's not tested. And if it never gets tested, they can end their life after a long and happy life with this imperfect thesis and nothing bad ever happened. But with the amount of incidents we're having, that oftentimes these imperfect theses are impacted by some moment where they're presented with a shock to the system. And then we, on our side, who spend our lives in this world and looking at managing through the natural occurrences most of the time, but the consequences of them, therefore are having to present them with an antithesis, right? So we're trying to present them with this, but they don't need to care about it for a long time. So we've got to present ultimately what we want them to do is come to some synthesis at the end. And sometimes a story does that through character or through whatever. They have this, or something in the story represents their imperfect thesis. And then you have your antithesis, and then at some point in the end, through that story, they do something in their head that starts to bring them towards synthesis. If I want to get overly academic about it, but we can do that in much better ways than we are. I think we're basic. We're being too basic. I think we need to be better.
One of our board members, Michael Player, who you might know, Drew, he's also from New Zealand. He really wanted to be here. In fact, he wanted to be here so much. When he couldn't be here, he gave me 3 pages of notes on the book. And I'll just read something he said about that thesis. He put it in a different sort of framing. He talked about beliefs and how the book is about, it's really, this point on beliefs is crucial to the book. Beliefs triumph over logic. And with the pandemic, we've seen this come to the fore. People fixate on misinformation tailored towards their underlying belief systems. Is that what you meant by thesis, Drew? And this then feeds on itself and cements in their subjective views. And it can lead to hideous actions which defy common sense and can heap misery on others in disaster situations, which almost sounds a bit like panic to me. But yeah, he sort of got the same interpretation from the book. And when I read his notes, I was really struck by the difference between what he took out and also what you've all said about the book and what I've taken away as well. We sort of have all latched onto different, like overall, we've got the same out of the book, but like there are things that jumped out at me were different to what jumped out from Michael and Monica and Drew and Peter. So yeah, really interesting. So we did start talking about how we can harness that altruism. Monica, you're in the coalface there, and do you sort of get a sense for it, your recovery working well, the community's sort of progressing and getting into a good place?
I do, and I think there's the, I guess, maybe more operational things that are happening, and then the council operational things that are happening that maybe are those sort of bigger ticket items, but the things that are really taking off in the community are the community-led programs and approaches, and council may be supporting, but sometimes I've come to really understand that it's not, you're not going to have 100% across the Shire at one point. Different community groups having this big wealth of success in one area and a different community group success in another area. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten your question and I'm going to loop it back somehow.
Yeah, I was wondering, what we're trying to get to is how do we solve this perennial problem of harnessing altruism so that it lasts and sustains really good structures for our communities in recovery?
Yes, and so I think my takeaway from that is that it's recognizing a lot of those community groups are non-profits, they're all volunteer based, and recognizing them outside of the disaster as well, and recognizing their value continuously, and knowing that they're there and that they are such an integral part of the journey, and recognizing their strengths in different ways. And I think that also goes back to Drew's point about storytelling. We sometimes, we don't want to steal their stories or steal their glories, but, council can provide an opportunity to highlight and share the story of the good works, and where perhaps, as a little bit of that maybe stereotypical, like, country resilient, self-reliant people, they don't like to be in the spotlight, but we can sort of step in and be like, look at all the great stuff that these guys have done, and often that builds connections, and other community groups go, that's awesome, I want to have a try of something similar. And so it's sort of that self-feeding growth, and to me, and linking back to altruism, is so many of those community groups are non-profit and volunteer. It's just this building of goodwill and knowledge, and altruism.
Magic, we've wrapped it up. I think we've got the solution.
Solved.
It sounds really good, and it's that local approach too that's so valuable, isn't it? It's and the councillors and the council staff being so integrated into their community. So what about you, Peter? Have you sort of got any ideas on how we can harness the altruism?
No, but I was thinking about, I know the issues that come up, because I've seen those come up often during the actual crisis. People become very focused on what needs to be done. There's an imperative facing them, whether it's the fire, the flood, whatever. So it's an imperative. Time is pressure. They don't have much time to go through alternatives, but support what's going on. And the reason I mentioned that, and I mentioned at the start, as a critical debrief, we're aware that communities come together at crisis, but post the crisis, they very much fall apart. And nothing falls apart more than trying to do a memorial for the actual event, because everybody will have a different idea about what that memorial will be, and that's usually when a lot of the conflict comes in. And I guess it comes back from group theory, I suspect, in the forming, norming, storming, forming, deforming sort of processes. And in the crisis, the first 3 stages happen very quickly. It's a bit like love at first sight, that everything comes together very quickly. And it's when you've got time to slow down and start looking at your partner and thinking, oh, they've got these behaviours, I'm not so thrilled about those, and that's where the forming comes in. I wonder, based on that theory and thinking about what's in there, whether we can build on some of the crisis to continue it on. And I'm thinking actually, it's from the book, so I'll tie it back to the book. She gives the example of London during the Blitz and the shelters that set up in the subways. Now, I always thought that was part of the plan, that the great British spirit, they all joined together in the subway. And of course, in the book, she highlights that's the last thing that the authority wanted was people gathering together, because they thought there'd be a great place for this dissent to evolve. But what came out of that, and we still have the posters, you know, the carry on posters. I can't think of what they actually say, but I think that's the sort of thing. It's taking that piece of memory from something that happened in the posters and transferring it into creating community spirit, which is, you know, just keep doing whatever, because and it create, you know, when you see those posters, I've forgotten what they actually say.
Keep calm and carry on.
Keep calm and carry on. But for me, you almost have a picture of people sitting in the subway with the bombs going off around it.
Yeah.
So whether that's those sort of visual sort of things that recreate the spirit of the time, that can sort of get past that unifying, dissolving bit when you start looking at the partner and say, oh, I actually found this quite nice. It's sort of recreating that sort of feeling to say, oh, it was nice. Maybe, you know, maybe this small trait's something we can overlook and work on. So
yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because the theorists say that if you skip over those a couple of those processes, the team is maybe not going to last as long as it could, or it may not produce results. Yeah, that's, I hadn't thought of applying that. Drew, what about you? What's your solution? We'll write a book on this when we're finished.
Well, I think similar to Monica, I love the comment Monica made just now, recognizing them outside disasters or something like that. You know, recognizing them outside of that moment. You know, we've reached that point here, though I didn't frame it that way, and I really love the phrase, so that's why my head's stuck in there. Like, I like the phrase, but so in terms of elevating their story, their work, I would tend to go not so much elevating them like heroes, but rather getting them to tell us the story of what they learned the hard way through something, or what they've discovered. So they're the conduit to the lesson rather than they're the star. And it's easier for someone who's a little more introverted to not think we're saying you're wonderful and then go, I'm, you know, many of them are not inclined, as Monica pointed out, to go, I was awesome, but they're more inclined to sit there and say, yeah, well, I'll help you through this if you go through it. So one of the things we learned was we had a phone tree and we activated the phone tree and nobody was there to pick up the phone because they're outside. You know, little things, but they will tell you the story that helps you come to the conclusion, maybe phone tree is not the be all and end all. For example, I'm just, you know, I noticed the amount of times that we put readiness information out over the last decade at the time of the disaster, and the readiness overall seems to sort of drop back down every time. So it's good in a response, but it's not the thing that grows the resilience. It grows the response capability in the moment, and then it goes back down. Whereas if we, rather than try to build people to a thought of preparedness of the vision that we have, but rather built community, it's rare that after after people know each other, they forget who each other is, for example. So I know perhaps building community and focusing on that rather than on more material things may have a better response in preparing a culture or developing a culture or an environment for altruistic behavior. There was an example we've had here, for example, sorry, okay, let's come back to comms. The bullet point, the end point for me, having considered these things as we've been talking, would be rather than telling people what to do, give the networks, the voices of those communities, the information they need to take the spirit of it with correct pieces in there, and to express that however is the best way to express it so it lands correctly. Take the spirit of it. Don't expect them to take the words. Don't expect them to regurgitate phrases. But once they understand the why and the principle, then they can say it anywhere they want to say it, and it'll work a lot better. So in terms of applying that to comms, it's giving them, rather than giving them the messages, the key messages, we're giving them the information that they need to create solutions for their own communities.
Yeah, that's probably a really good point to end on, because she talked in the book about someone that she had been talking to said of the volunteers, it's not the how they volunteer, it's the why they volunteer. And if we understand that, then we will probably be able to sustain their activity much longer and sort of reap the benefits from that. So thank you all for this discussion. It's been, always is a really good discussion when we all get together and just shoot the breeze with something to prompt our conversation. Hopefully we'll see you at the webinar next month, the end of this month, which is two weeks. It's like usually the last Wednesday of the month, and then one of the conferences. Thank you all.